The rough burlap scratched against Elizabeth's face as strong hands dragged her toward the makeshift auction block in the center of Millfield's town square. Through the coarse fabric, she could hear the murmur of voices, the scraping of boots against dirt, and the occasional bark of laughter that made her stomach turn. 6 months ago, she had been Miss Elizabeth Catherine Ward, head teacher at the prestigious Ashwood Academy for Young Ladies. Now she was nothing more than chattel, sold to pay off debts she never knew existed. The nightmare had begun when her father's gambling addiction finally caught up with their family. Samuel Ward had been a respected banker in Boston, but behind closed doors, he'd been hemorrhaging money at underground poker games and horse races. When the creditors came calling, they didn't just want the house and the family business, they wanted blood. In the lawless territories where debts were settled with flesh rather than coin, Elizabeth had become the payment. "What do we have here, folks?" The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, his words slurred with whiskey. "A fine specimen, I'm told. Educated, well-bred, comes from good stock back east. Starting bid is $50. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she stood on the wooden platform, the bag still covering her head. She had been traveling for weeks in a covered wagon, given barely enough food and water to survive. Her captors had told her nothing except that she was being taken somewhere to settle accounts. The refined dresses she once wore had been replaced with a rough cotton shift that hung loose on her diminished frame. $60, called out a voice from the crowd. 75, shouted another. The bidding continued, and with each number called out, Elizabeth felt a piece of her dignity slip away. She thought of her students at Ashwood, proper young ladies from the finest families in Boston. She had taught them literature, mathematics, and proper etiquette. Now she was being sold like livestock in some godforsaken frontier town. $125. The voice that cut through the others was different, deeper, quieter, but carrying an authority that made the crowd pause. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. Heavy footsteps approached the platform. Elizabeth felt a firm but gentle hand take her arm and guide her down the steps. Only when they were away from the crowd did the stranger reach up and carefully remove the burlap sack from her head. Elizabeth blinked in the harsh sunlight, her eyes streaming as they adjusted to the brightness. The man standing before her was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the practical clothes of a working man rather than the fine suits she was accustomed to seeing. His dark hair was touched with grey at the temples, and his weathered face spoke of years spent outdoors. But his eyes, they were kind, not cruel, and held a sadness that seemed to echo her own. "My name is Thomas Blackwood," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for what's been done to you, miss. I know who you are." Elizabeth stared at him in confusion. You know me?" "Elizabeth Ward, formerly of the Ashwood Academy. Your disappearance was in all the newspapers, even out here. Your students organized search parties. There's a substantial reward for your safe return." Hope fluttered in Elizabeth's chest for the first time in months. "You're taking me home?" Thomas's expression grew troubled. "I wish I could, but it's not that simple. The men who brought you here, they're not ordinary debt collectors. They're part of a network that the law can't touch, at least not yet. If I tried to take you back east now, they'd hunt us both down. You need time to recover, and I need time to find a safe way to get you home." He led her to a simple wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "My ranch is about an hour's ride from here. You'll be safe there while we figure out our next move." As they rode through the rugged landscape, Thomas explained his situation. He was a widower with 4 children, trying to make a living raising cattle and horses on a spread he'd inherited from his late wife's father. His oldest daughter, Sarah, was 16 and had been trying to manage the household and help with her younger siblings, but it was too much for someone so young. "The truth is, Miss Ward, I could use your help as much as you need mine. My children need proper schooling, and I'm not equipped to give it to them. If you're willing, you could teach them while you're here. It would give you purpose and give them something they've been lacking." Elizabeth considered his proposal as the wagon wheels rolled over the dusty trail. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was better than the alternatives that had been racing through her mind since her capture. The Blackwood Ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a two-story farmhouse surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. As they pulled up to the front porch, 4 faces appeared at the windows, curious, cautious, but not unwelcoming. Thomas helped Elizabeth down from the wagon. "Children, come meet Miss Ward. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Sarah emerged first, a tall girl with her father's dark hair and serious demeanor. Behind her came the 3 younger children, Michael, 13, and Gangley, with the awkwardness of approaching manhood, Catherine, 10 and bright-eyed with pigtails that needed rebraiding, and little James, barely 6, who hid behind his sister's skirts. "Miss Ward was a teacher back east," Thomas explained. "She's going to help with your lessons." Sarah stepped forward, extending her hand with the formal politeness of someone forced to grow up too quickly. "Welcome to our home, Miss Ward. I'm sorry for your troubles." The simple kindness in the girl's voice nearly brought Elizabeth to tears. It had been so long since anyone had shown her genuine sympathy. "Thank you, Sarah. I look forward to getting to know all of you." Thomas showed Elizabeth to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. It had a window that looked out over the rolling hills beyond the ranch, and a simple wooden desk where she could prepare lessons. After months of uncertainty and fear, having her own space again felt like a luxury beyond measure. That first night at dinner, Elizabeth observed the family dynamics with a teacher's eye. The children were well-mannered, but clearly lacking in formal education. Sarah had been doing her best to teach the younger ones, but her own knowledge was limited. Michael was bright but restless, clearly needing more challenging material to keep his attention. Catherine was eager to learn, but had developed some bad habits in her handwriting and arithmetic, and little James, despite his shyness, showed signs of a quick mind that just needed proper nurturing. "Miss Ward," Thomas said as they finished their meal, "I want you to know that you're not a servant here. You're a guest, and if you choose to help with the children's education, it will be as a favor to us, not an obligation." Elizabeth met his steady gaze. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your kindness more than you know, but I think we both understand that I need purpose as much as your children need education. If I'm to stay here, I want to earn my keep." And so began Elizabeth's new life on the Blackwood Ranch. She established a proper schoolroom in the farmhouse's front parlor, creating lesson plans that challenged each child at their appropriate level. Sarah, she discovered, had a remarkable aptitude for literature and could write with surprising eloquence when given the chance. Michael excelled in mathematics and showed an interest in the scientific principles behind farming and animal husbandry. Catherine absorbed everything like a sponge, particularly history and geography, while James proved to have an almost photographic memory for the stories Elizabeth read aloud. But teaching the Blackwood children was only part of Elizabeth's new routine. She also found herself naturally falling into other roles around the ranch. She helped Sarah with meal planning and cooking, teaching her more sophisticated techniques than frontier life typically allowed. She tended to scrape knees and hurt feelings with equal care. She even assisted Thomas with the ranch's bookkeeping, her mathematical skills proving invaluable for tracking expenses and profits. As weeks turned into months, Elizabeth began to feel something she hadn't experienced since before her father's gambling destroyed their family. She felt useful, valued, even loved. The children stopped treating her like a guest and began including her in their family jokes and traditions. Thomas, initially formal and cautious, gradually opened up about his own struggles and dreams for his children's futures. But Elizabeth's past was never far from her thoughts. Late at night, she would lie awake wondering about her students at Ashwood, about the friends and colleagues who must be wondering what had happened to her. She wrote letters, dozens of them, that she could never send, pouring her heart out on paper that she would later burn in the fireplace. The first real test of her new life came during the harsh winter. A blizzard struck the region, trapping them in the house for nearly a week. When the storm finally passed, they discovered that several of their cattle had died, and the roof of the barn had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. Thomas worked himself to exhaustion, trying to repair the damage and save what livestock he could. It was during this crisis that Elizabeth truly proved her worth. She organized the children into efficient work crews, having Sarah help with cooking while Michael and Catherine assisted with cleaning and organizing supplies. She even ventured out into the snow herself to help Thomas with the animals, despite having no experience with ranch work. Her soft teacher's hands grew calloused, and her pale complexion gained color from the outdoor work, but she persevered. "I don't know what we would have done without you," Thomas told her one evening as they sat by the fire, the children finally asleep after the long, difficult day. Elizabeth looked up from the sock she was mending, another skill she'd acquired out of necessity. "You would have managed. You always do." "Maybe," he said quietly, "but it wouldn't have been the same. You've brought something to this house that's been missing since Mary died." Mary, his late wife. Thomas rarely spoke of her, but Elizabeth knew from the children's occasional comments that she had been beloved, and that her death in childbirth with their youngest had left a hole in the family that they'd all been struggling to fill. "What was she like?" Elizabeth asked gently. Thomas stared into the fire for a long moment. "Strong, determined. She could make a feast out of nothing and turn a house into a home just by being in it. She would have liked you, I think. You have that same quality, that ability to make everything around you better just by caring." Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know." Spring brought new challenges and new revelations. Word reached them that the authorities back east were still investigating Elizabeth's disappearance, and that some of the men involved in the debt collection network had been arrested. Thomas made discreet inquiries about the possibility of Elizabeth returning home safely, but the news was discouraging. The remaining members of the criminal organization were still at large, and they had long memories for those who crossed them. "I could try to get word to your family that you're safe," Thomas offered. "Let them know you're alive without revealing where you are." Elizabeth considered this carefully. The thought of her elderly aunt, her only remaining family member, worrying about her fate was agonizing, but she also knew that any contact could potentially lead her captors to the ranch, endangering not just herself, but the Blackwood family as well. "Not yet," she decided. "As much as it pains me, it's too dangerous. But someday, when this is all over, I want to see her again." As spring turned to summer, Elizabeth found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. A letter arrived from a contact of Thomas's in the territorial capital, a U.S. Marshal who specialized in cases involving organized crime. The network that had taken Elizabeth was finally being dismantled, and it might soon be safe for her to return east. But as Elizabeth read the letter, she realized with a shock that the prospect of leaving the ranch filled her with dread rather than joy. Somewhere along the way, the Blackwood family had become her family. The children looked to her not just as a teacher, but as a mother figure. And Thomas, their relationship had evolved into something deeper than employer and employee, or even friendship. "You're thinking about staying," Thomas observed that evening as they walked together around the property, checking on the animals before bed. Elizabeth didn't try to deny it. "Is that foolish of me? 6 months ago I would have said this life was impossible. But now? Now I can't imagine going back to the world I came from. Those young ladies at Ashwood, they were sweet girls, but they lived in a bubble. Everything was predetermined for them. Their marriages, their social positions, their entire lives mapped out by their families' expectations. Here, I feel like I'm actually making a difference. I'm helping shape minds that will go out and build something meaningful in this world." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her. "Elizabeth, I need to tell you something. That first day when I bought you at that auction, I didn't just know who you were because of the newspaper stories. I had been looking for you. Elizabeth's breath caught. What do you mean? Your aunt contacted a detective agency when you disappeared. They traced the debt collectors west and put out word that there was a reward for information about your whereabouts. When I heard you were going to be auctioned in Millfield, I rode there with the intention of buying your freedom and sending you home. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Because when I saw you up there, saw what those animals had done to you, I realized you needed more than just rescue. You needed time to heal, to rebuild yourself, and selfishly, I needed you too. My children needed you. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. So all this time, you've been planning to send me away. I was. But somewhere along the way, I started hoping you'd choose to stay, not out of obligation or fear, but because you wanted to be here, because this became your home. Elizabeth reached for his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of a life of honest work. Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Anything. If you had the chance to send me back to Boston tomorrow, with a guarantee of my safety and no risk to your family, would you do it? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. If that's what you wanted, yes. Your happiness matters more to me than my own feelings. And what are your feelings? That I love you, he said simply. Not as a teacher for my children or a helper around the ranch, but as a woman. As someone I want to build a life with if you'll have me. Elizabeth felt something inside her chest unfold, like a flower blooming after a long winter. I love you too, and I love your children as if they were my own. This is my home now, Thomas. This is where I choose to be. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his palms. Are you sure? You're giving up a lot. Your old life, your career, everything you worked for. I'm not giving up anything, Elizabeth said firmly. I'm choosing something better. I'm choosing a life where I matter, where my work has meaning, where I'm loved for who I am, rather than what I represent. When Thomas kissed her, it was with the tenderness of a man who had almost lost hope of finding love again, and the passion of someone who had discovered something worth fighting for. The wedding was a simple affair, held in the front yard of the ranch, with only the children and a few neighboring families in attendance. Elizabeth wore a dress that Sarah had helped her sew from fabric they'd ordered from the general store. Nothing like the elaborate gown she might have worn in Boston, but perfect for the woman she had become. As she spoke her vows, Elizabeth thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been torn from her old life by force and cruelty, sold like property, stripped of her dignity and her dreams. But somehow, in losing everything she thought she wanted, she had found everything she never knew she needed. The children, who had long since stopped calling her Miss Ward in favor of Mother, beamed with joy as Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Life on the ranch would continue to be hard, full of challenges and uncertainties. But it was real, built on genuine love and mutual respect rather than social expectations or financial arrangements. As the years passed, Elizabeth's story became legend in the territory. The refined Eastern lady who had found happiness in the wilderness, who had turned tragedy into triumph through sheer force of will and the power of love. She never did return to Boston, though she eventually was able to contact her aunt and receive word that the last of her father's creditors had been brought to justice. She continued teaching, not just her own children, but those of neighboring families who recognized the value of a proper education. Her little schoolroom grew into a real schoolhouse, and then into a small academy that drew students from across the territory. She and Thomas had 3 children of their own, who grew up alongside their older siblings in a household that valued learning, hard work, and kindness above all else. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled across the plains, Elizabeth would remember that terrifying day when she stood on the auction block with a bag over her head, not knowing if she would live or die. But she no longer thought of it as the worst day of her life. Instead, She saw it as the day her real life began, the day she stopped being what others expected her to be and started becoming who she was meant to be. The rough burlap bag that had once symbolized her degradation now hung in a place of honor in her study, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we cannot know what doors are opening for us. Sometimes the things that seem to destroy us are actually preparing us for the lives we were always meant to live. Lives that are messier and harder than what we planned, but infinitely more meaningful than what we left behind. In the end, Elizabeth Ward Blackwood learned that home isn't a place you come from. It's a place you choose, and people you choose to build it with, one day at a time, through seasons of drought and plenty, through sorrow and joy, through all the beautiful, terrible, wonderful moments that make up a life truly lived. 20 years after that fateful day at the auction block, Elizabeth stood in her classroom watching her youngest daughter, Margaret, help a struggling student with his arithmetic. The little schoolhouse had grown into a proper academy, with 3 teachers under Elizabeth's guidance, and students coming from as far as 200 miles away to receive what had become known as the finest education west of the Mississippi. Thomas entered the classroom, carrying a telegram, his face bearing the weight of news, both long-awaited and complex. Elizabeth dismissed the children early and took the yellow paper with trembling hands. It was from her aunt's lawyer in Boston. The old woman had passed peacefully in her sleep, leaving Elizabeth a substantial inheritance and a final letter. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Elizabeth read her aunt's words aloud. The letter spoke of pride in Elizabeth's courage, of understanding why she had chosen to build a new life rather than return to the constraints of Boston society. But it also contained a surprise. Her aunt had spent years documenting Elizabeth's story, working with journalists and women's rights advocates to ensure that her niece's experience would serve as a beacon of hope for other women trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "You see, my dear Elizabeth," the letter continued in her aunt's familiar handwriting, "your story has already changed more lives than you know. Young women across the country have read about the teacher who refused to let tragedy define her, who built something beautiful from the ashes of her former life. You have become a symbol of what is possible when we refuse to accept the limitations others place upon us." The inheritance, her aunt explained, came with a challenge. She had established a fund to help other women in desperate circumstances, those fleeing abusive marriages, those sold into servitude, those who needed a fresh start but lacked the resources to begin again. Elizabeth was to oversee this fund, using her experience and wisdom to guide its distribution. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth looked around at her family. Sarah, now married with children of her own, but still living nearby. Michael, who had become a successful rancher and part-time surveyor. Catherine, training to be a teacher herself. James, preparing to attend college back east, and her 3 younger children with Thomas, all bright-eyed and full of possibility. "I think," she said slowly, "that we're going to need a bigger schoolhouse." The Elizabeth Ward Foundation, as it came to be known, transformed not just the lives of the women it helped, but the entire character of the territory. Elizabeth used her aunt's money wisely, establishing not just educational opportunities, but practical training programs, teaching women skills that would allow them to support themselves and their children independently. She created safe houses where women could stay while they rebuilt their lives, and she developed a network of families like her own who were willing to provide temporary homes for those in need. One autumn morning, a covered wagon pulled up to the ranch carrying 3 women and 5 children, all fleeing from situations that mirrored Elizabeth's own past in different ways. There was Clara, a young widow whose in-laws had tried to sell her to pay off their son's debts. Maria, who had escaped an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, and Ruth, a former indentured servant whose contract had been extended illegally year after year. As Elizabeth helped them down from the wagon, she saw in their eyes the same mixture of fear, hope, and determination that she had once carried. "Welcome," she told them, her voice steady and warm. "You're safe now. And more than that, you're home for as long as you need to be." The transformation of these women over the following months reminded Elizabeth daily of the miracle of her own journey. Clara discovered a talent for business and eventually opened a successful dress shop in town. Maria became one of Elizabeth's most gifted teachers, specializing in helping immigrant children learn English. Ruth, who had been denied education her entire life, threw herself into learning with such passion that she eventually earned certification to practice as a midwife. But perhaps the most profound change came in Elizabeth herself. She had always been a teacher, but now she understood that her greatest lesson was not found in any textbook. It was the living proof that no matter how far we fall, no matter how completely our old lives are destroyed, we have the power to rebuild ourselves into something stronger, more compassionate, and more authentic than we ever imagined possible. On her 50th birthday, Elizabeth received a letter that would have seemed impossible during those dark days following her capture. It was from the president of Ashwood Academy, where she had once taught. The school wanted to establish a scholarship in her name, funding the education of young women from disadvantaged backgrounds who showed promise but lacked resources. "Your story has become legendary among our students," the letter read. "They speak of you as proof that education is not just about acquiring knowledge, but about developing the strength of character to face whatever life may bring. We hope that bearing your name, these scholarships will inspire other young women to embrace both learning and courage." Elizabeth shared the letter with Thomas as they sat on their porch that evening, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where she had once taught her stepchildren their first proper lessons. The woman who had been sold with a bag over her head was now being honored by one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the country. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been at that auction that day?" Thomas asked, his arm around her shoulders. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "I think I would have found my way somehow. Maybe not to this exact life, but to some version of happiness. I've learned that strength doesn't come from avoiding hardship. It comes from refusing to let hardship diminish who we're meant to become." She paused, watching little Margaret chase her cousin around the oak tree that Thomas had planted the year they were married. "But I'm grateful it was you. I'm grateful for all of it, even the terrible parts, because they led me here, to this family, to this work, to this life that I never could have imagined but couldn't imagine living without." As the sun set over the ranch that had become the unlikely center of a movement for women's independence and education, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been stolen from one life and thrust into another. But somewhere in that painful transition, she had discovered that the most important freedom is not the absence of hardship, but the presence of choice. The choice to define ourselves by how we respond to what happens to us, rather than by what happens to us. The story of the woman sold with a bag over her head had become the story of the teacher who removed that bag and helped others see clearly, who transformed her own rescue into a lifelong mission of rescuing others, and who proved that sometimes the most powerful education happens not in a classroom, but in the living of a life dedicated to lifting others up from wherever they have fallen. Years later, when Elizabeth was in her 70s and her hair had turned silver, a young journalist traveled from New York City to interview her for a book about pioneering women of the American frontier. The young woman, ambitious and well-educated, arrived expecting to find a weathered pioneer struggling with the hardships of frontier life. Instead, she found Elizabeth in her study, surrounded by correspondence from women across the nation, still actively managing the foundation that had grown to help hundreds of women each year. "Mrs. Blackwood," the journalist began, her pencil poised over her notepad, "many people consider you a victim who overcame tragedy. How do you see yourself? Elizabeth set down the letter she had been reading, a thank you note from a young woman who had just graduated from medical school with help from the foundation, and smiled. My dear, I stopped seeing myself as a victim the day I realized that my greatest tragedy had led to my greatest purpose. What happened to me was terrible, yes, but it was also the beginning of something beautiful, not just for me, but for all the women who found their way to our doors afterward. The journalist scribbled furiously. Do you ever regret not returning to Boston when you had the chance? Never, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. That life belonged to a different woman, one who was content to teach privileged girls to be ornamental wives. The woman I became had work to do that could only be accomplished by someone who truly understood what it meant to lose everything and build it back again. As the interview concluded and the journalist prepared to leave, she asked one final question. What would you say to women today who find themselves in impossible situations, who feel like their lives are over? Elizabeth walked to the window and looked out at the thriving community that had grown around her little ranch. The schoolhouse had become a college. The safe houses had multiplied throughout the territory, and dozens of women who had once arrived broken and desperate were now teachers, business owners, wives and mothers, living lives of dignity and purpose. I would tell them, she said quietly, that sometimes God removes us from one story so he can write us into a better one. The bag over your head today might be hiding the face of the woman you're meant to become tomorrow. Trust the journey, even when you can't see where it's leading, especially then. That evening, after the journalist had departed, Elizabeth sat at her desk writing in the leather journal that Thomas had given her so many years ago. The pages were filled now with decades of thoughts, prayers, and reflections. Tonight she wrote what would become her final entry. To whoever finds this journal after I am gone, know that every word written here comes from a heart that learned to beat again after it was broken. When I was dragged to that auction block, I believed my life was ending. I could not have imagined that it was actually beginning. The woman who stood there trembling in fear became the woman who now sits here in peace, surrounded by the love of a family that chose her and the gratitude of countless women whose lives were changed because she learned to change her own. If you are reading this and your own life feels shattered beyond repair, remember that broken things can be made beautiful again. Not the same as they were, but something entirely new. Something that could never have existed without the breaking. The scars you carry are not signs of weakness. They are proof of your strength, maps of battles fought and won, evidence that you survived what was meant to destroy you. I have lived to see 5 generations of women pass through our doors. I have watched broken girls become strong women, watched desperate mothers become successful businesswomen, watched victims become advocates. Each one taught me something new about the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of hope. But perhaps the greatest lesson came from watching my own children, both those born to me and those I chose to love as my own, grow into adults who understood that a person's worth is not determined by their circumstances, but by their character. My stepchildren, who could have resented a stranger thrust into their family, instead taught me that love is not limited by bloodlines. My biological children, born into a life of purpose and service, learned that privilege comes with responsibility. All of them carry forward the understanding that we are called not just to build our own lives, but to help others build theirs. The foundation that began with my aunt's inheritance has grown beyond anything I could have envisioned. It now operates in 12 states, has helped over 3,000 women, and has established 47 schools for children whose mothers needed a second chance. But numbers cannot capture the real impact. The children who grew up with educated mothers, the communities that were strengthened by women who were given opportunities to contribute, the ripple effects of hope that spread outward from each life that was transformed. Thomas often asked me why I never wrote a book about my experiences, why I never sought the fame that such a dramatic story might have brought. The answer is simple. I was too busy living the sequel. The story of what happened to me was just the prologue to the story of what I did with what happened to me. And that story was written not in words on a page, but in the lives of real people who found their way to freedom because someone else had walked that path before them. When people learn about my past, they often express pity for what I endured. But I have come to see that experience differently. Yes, I was victimized, but I was not destroyed. Yes, I lost the life I had planned, but I gained a life I never could have imagined. The auction block where I stood in shame became the foundation stone for a legacy of dignity. The bag that hid my face became the symbol of every mask we wear to hide our pain. And the removal of that bag became a metaphor for the revelation of our true selves. I am grateful, not for the evil that was done to me, but for the good that came through it. Grateful for Thomas, who saw worth where others saw only damaged goods. Grateful for children who taught me that family is made, not born. Grateful for the women who trusted me with their stories and allowed me to be part of their healing. Grateful for a life that proved that endings can become beginnings, that victims can become victors, that even the most devastating circumstances can become the soil from which something beautiful grows. To my family reading this, you are my greatest achievement, my most precious treasure, the living proof that love multiplies when it is shared rather than hoarded. To the women who will come after, remember that your past does not disqualify you from your future. You are not damaged goods. You are not broken beyond repair. You are warriors who have survived, and that survival has prepared you for a purpose that can only be fulfilled by someone who has walked through fire and emerged refined rather than consumed. And to anyone who feels lost, forgotten, or discarded, know that your story is not over. The chapter that feels like an ending may actually be the beginning of your greatest adventure. Sometimes we must lose everything we thought we wanted in order to find everything we never knew we needed. Trust the process, even when it hurts. Trust the journey, even when you cannot see the destination. And most of all, trust that you have within you everything necessary to not just survive, but to thrive. Elizabeth set down her pen and looked around the study that had become the nerve center of a movement. Tomorrow, she would celebrate her 75th birthday, surrounded by family and friends, by women whose lives had been touched by her work, by children and grandchildren who carried her values into the future. But tonight, she was content to sit in the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a story that had transformed from tragedy to triumph, through the simple act of refusing to let circumstances define destiny. Outside her window, the moon cast silver light across the ranch, where a desperate woman had once arrived, not knowing if she was being rescued or simply transferred from one form of captivity to another. Now it was a place of learning, healing, and hope, a beacon for anyone who needed to believe that redemption was possible, that second chances could become first-class lives, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the words, "and then everything changed."